Good evening. Thank you, Carl, and thank you for your perseverance and vision. He's been kind of chasing me for a couple of years that I would come to Australia for this special event, and he got his way, and he's a very convincing person. And I want to thank the whole team. I know it takes a village to put on an event like this, and I'm grateful for all of you and all who are here, because this is obviously an extremely precious moment in human history and in planetary history. And to wake one another up is our common calling at this time. So gatherings like this are extremely important at a time like this. We look for signs of hope as well as challenge and adventure and courage. So as you all know, this past year, a group of international scientists submitted to the United Nations a report about how things are going in this planet of ours. And they concluded that we have, as of last year, 12 years left. So that's like 11 and a half years left to really change our direction as a species. So this, it seems to me, puts everything into a new context. Every gathering we have, this gathering, but any time we get together, we all have to be thinking about this reality, that the path we're on as a species that is leading to extreme climate change, global upset, is simply not sustainable. It's simply not sustainable. And if we say we love our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, it's only true if we're committed to doing something about altering the direction that we're on. Now, the role of religion, it seems to me, is significant in its essence, which is spirituality. There's a lot of people today who do not want to call themselves religious. In my country, 80% of people under 30 prefer to call themselves spiritual and not religious. And this kind of language is spreading in many directions, in many places. In the Roman Catholic Church in my country, a new language has emerged. People used to talk about themselves as ex-Catholics or not practicing Catholics, but a new term came up this past year called runaway Catholics. Runaway Catholics. And I don't think I have to explain that language to you. I think that term is going to catch on in a lot of places. I was in Ireland just a few weeks ago, and 15 years ago in Ireland, 95% of the population were practicing Catholics. Today, it is 14%. 14%. It's a stunning sociological upheaval. A few years ago, I was invited to be on a conference in Monterrey, Mexico, which was about values, a values conference. They have it every year. It was a very large conference, 6,500 people in the auditorium, and 92,000 people online, of which I learned after the event, 75 people were in the Vatican online watching this event. And I was invited to kick the conference off along with Father Leonard Boff, ex-Franciscan priest, Leonardo Boff, liberation theologian from Brazil. So he spoke about Mother Earth and how Mother Earth is being treated today like the poorest of the poor are being treated. That she is suffering what the poor are suffering. And I was asked to speak about a program that I had been developing for inner city teenagers, an educational program. I took my pedagogy that I developed over many years for adults and kind of boiled it down for inner city children, because in my country, 64% of black boys are not graduating from high school today. 64%. Now, does that mean that they're dumb? Or does it mean that the way we're defining education is dumb? That we're leaving out the heart. We're leaving out creativity and art. So I created a pilot program for 2 years, and where the center of the learning experience was art and values. And the result was that 100% of the students in our program wanted to stay in school. Why? Because they experienced the joy of learning. We had them making movies. We had them creating poetry, dance, rap around values that they could identify with and believe in. Now, after Leonardo and myself gave these opening talks, we were invited to the stage, and there was a big bowl of questions there, little pieces of paper wrapped up. We couldn't cheat to know what the questions were. And each of us was to pick a piece of paper, respond to the question for 3 minutes, and then the other was to respond to the same question for 3 minutes. And one of the questions that Leonardo picked up were pieces of paper, and I'm so glad that he went first on this one. This was a question: is the Roman Catholic Church dying in South America today? And his answer was yes. And then when he went on and talked about interfaith and how important that was, and how we had to link up with the wisdom of other traditions, etc., etc. Then it was my turn to respond to the same question. And I said, well, it's not just the Roman Catholic Church that is dying in South America today. All the churches that I'm familiar with in the West are undergoing great demise. And I said that I think a lot of it is from Gaia herself, that Mother Earth knows her own suffering and knows that the time is running out, that we're living in a time of extinction and spasm that has not been paralleled for 65 million years. The last time so many species were going extinct was 65 million years ago, when the dinosaurs went extinct and many species with them. And of course that was caused by a meteor exploding in the Gulf of Mexico. Today the meteor that's exploding is the human species, that we are the prime cause of this collapse that is going on. And so I think that Gaia is calling, especially the younger generation, to move beyond a lot of institutional organized religion, to get down to the essence of religion, because we can't afford all the trappings anymore. The way I put it was, we can't travel with basilicas on our back anymore. Backpacks have to do. We have to find spiritual practices that are portable, that are available to everybody, that are not elitist, and not dictated from a hierarchical place, top down, but that begin in the human heart and begin with our new relationships, not only with one another, with other humans, but with all the other species. As the Lakota people pray, Ahomatakiyasi, all our relations. All of our relations have to be cleaned up today. I was with a very well-known scientist at Stanford University a few years ago, and he said to me, you know, we are the first species, he's a biologist, we're the first species in 4.5 billion years of this planet that can choose not to go extinct. And then he added, of course, we haven't made that choice yet. Well, this 11.5 years is making the choice for us. If we don't wake up, if we don't wake one another up, and if we don't listen to the suffering of the world and how the other species are trying to wake us up. Over 20 years ago, I met a shaman who said to me, the four-legged ones are very worried about us two-legged ones. So worried that they're having conferences about us. Kind of like this conference. And he said they have determined at least two things. Those who are our pets are going to be more assertive, and the four-legged ones are going to enter our dreams more fully. Just a year ago, I went into the same shaman, and I said, are the four-legged ones still having conferences about us two-legged ones and still talking about us? He said, yes, they're still having conferences, but they're not talking about us anymore. They are shouting about us. This is all about Mother Earth waking up, shaking us up. Every one of us, 18 or 88, has a role to play at this critical time in human and planetary history. It is an amazing moment to be invited to be on this earth and to contribute to this great awakening, which Rana Macy calls the Great Turning. But we can't do it with all the burdens of religion on our backs. Here's what Rabbi Heschel, a very great scholar of the prophets, and not hiding in his ivy towers, but he practiced what he preached. For example, he marched with Dr. King at Selma, and it took a lot of abuse from his own Jewish community at the time. They said there's enough anti-Semitism in America without invading the lands of segregation, etc., and stirring things up. He never answered those negative remarks, but his daughter did. Suzanne Heschel is today a feminist theologian. And when she tells me that when she speaks to Jewish groups, she tells them, if you have a picture of my father marching with Dr. King, it's a very iconic photograph, you should take it down from your wall. You have no right to show it on your wall because when he really needed your support, you weren't there. Most of the Jewish community was complaining about what he was doing. She says that when she was 10, her father came back from the marches with King, and she asked him, Daddy, what was it like? And he said, I felt my feet were praying. I felt my feet were praying. The prayer of our time needs to involve all the chakras. This movement of young people, mostly young people, called Extinction Rebellion, is responding in many creative ways and nonviolent ways to wake so many up. A lot of young people, teenagers, as you know, led by this Swedish girl who was 15 a year ago, 16 this year, who's organizing strikes by teenagers to wake the adults up. This is their future that is being forfeited because too many adults and too many religions, churches, are complacent, are not at all passionate and fired up and moving. Here's what Heschel says about the shadow side of religion. It is customary to blame secular science and anti-religious philosophy for the eclipse of religion in modern society. It would be more honest to blame religion for its own defeats. Religion declined not because it was refuted, but because it became irrelevant, dull, oppressive, insipid. I'm going to land on this word insipid because it's a very rich word. According to the Webster Dictionary, insipid means vapid, flat, jejune, banal, inane, devoid of qualities that make for spirit and character. Its opposite is zestful, adventurous. Insipid means lacking taste or savor, being tasteless, lacking in qualities that interest, stimulate, or challenge. Is this the current state of much of religion today that Heschel predicted? Heschel goes on, when faith is completely replaced by creed, when worship is replaced by discipline, love by habit, and the crisis of today is ignored because of the splendor of the past, when faith becomes an heirloom rather than a living fountain, when religion speaks only in the name of authority rather than with the voice of compassion, its message becomes meaningless. So that's at the heart of Heschel's critique of religion. And I think that it rings true for a lot of people who today want to call themselves spiritual and not religious. Gregory Bateson, in the 1970s, a scientist, he was married to Margaret Mead, the anthropologist, for a number of years, though they did separate. He asked this question back in the 70s. He said, is the human species rotting its mind from a slowly deteriorating religion and education? Are we rotting our minds from a slowly deteriorating religion and education? A very strong sentence from a very thoughtful man. Well, what's the medicine for all this? What's the medicine for moving into a new era of spirituality? And that includes, of course, waking us up to religion. And what are some of the causes of the demise of religion as we've known it? Myself, I look at the year 1600, the launching of the 17th century. It was a Jubilee year declared by the Pope in Rome. And the year 1600 was the year that they burned Giordano Bruno at the stake. First they tortured him, they cut out his tongue and so forth. And they burned him at the stake. Giordano Bruno was a Dominican, like I was a Dominican, and Meister Eckhart was Dominican, and Thomas Aquinas was a Dominican. And in the spirit of Thomas Aquinas, he was very interested in science. He was bringing the new Copernican worldview into the world of faith. And for that, they burned him at the stake. And I think when that happened, that science noticed. And they said, these believers, they can be kind of fierce. Let's work out a truce. Why don't you believers, you religious people, why don't you take the soul and we'll take the cosmos? Oh, what a deal, thought many religious thinkers who had been trained in Augustine's notion that all of nature was fallen and is irrelevant to the salvation of humans. So that's essentially what happened. Religion and science split. And the result was a tremendous schizophrenia in our Western culture. Science went out with a pretty modest conscience and underdeveloped conscience and found the powers of the universe, including atomic power, nuclear power, and the rest. And often sold its soul to chemical corporations, to military agendas, to nationalistic ideologies, and so forth. Meanwhile, religion without the cosmos became more and more introspective, more and more neurotic, asking questions that aren't even in the Bible, like, am I saved? Christopher Stendhal points out that question is not a biblical question at all. It's a neurotic question. And Christopher Stendhal is one of the great New Testament scholars of the last generation. Otto Rank, the great 20th century psychologist and I think a prophet, he says, when religion in the West lost the cosmos, society became neurotic. And we had to invent psychology to deal with the neurosis. The whole society became neurotic when you're no longer connected to the whole, to the universe. And a lot of our compulsions, dictated by consumer capitalism, for example, our addictions, and certainly our genocide toward indigenous peoples and other religions that still kept the soul connected to the cosmos. A lot of that was driven by this schizophrenia. Because in pre-modern thinking, this is why I'm so attracted to the medieval mystics, Meister Eckhart, or Aquinas, or Hildegard of Bingen, or Nicholas of Cusa, about whom David Bohm, the physicist, said, I owe more to Cusa than I do to Einstein, which is quite stunning statement from a late 20th century physicist. That is because pre-modern thinkers, like indigenous people everywhere, know that the human soul seeks to be connected to the universe itself, to the cosmos. And when it is not connected to the cosmos, it is very lonely, and it has a big hole in its soul that needs filling, that needs a lot of filling. Indeed, there was a theologian a number of years ago from Australia who was lecturing in Africa, and he was being translated into Swahili. So he'd speak a few sentences in the Swahili translation, a few sentences Swahili translation. He came to the culmination of his talk. He said the number one spiritual problem in Sydney is loneliness. The translator said, please repeat your sentence, which he did. The translator huddled with several other Africans, came to the microphone and said, I'm sorry, sir, but in our language, we do not have a word for loneliness. That says it all. The cosmic loneliness of the Western soul and Western religion when we cut our psyche off from cosmos. Thomas Aquinas says, pre-modern thinker, every human being is capax universi, capable of the universe. And I think this is precisely why indigenous people who had a living cosmology that was ripped away from them, usually in the name of religion, are set up for addictions. Because I call alcoholism liquid cosmology, or drugs cosmology by a needle. We are here to experience the ecstasy of the universe, and we are being deprived of it in a worldview that is anthropocentric, human-centered, or what Pope Francis has correctly called narcissistic. That is what our species has become in the West over the last centuries, the modern era. Here's how Carl Jung put it. The development of Western philosophy during the last 2 centuries has succeeded in isolating the mind in its own sphere and in severing it from its primal oneness with the universe. So even a psychologist recognizes this profoundly religious issue. And Otto Rank, whom I already referred to, another brilliant psychologist, says, he calls for a restoration of a union with the cosmos, which once existed and was then lost. So the return of a sense of our relationship to the cosmos. And remember that, as Thomas Berry says, ecology is functional cosmology. So the collapse of the environment, of the ecological relationship, interconnected relationship, this is directly connected to the loss of a sense of the whole and of the cosmos. Now, I had a dream several years ago that was what Native Americans would call a big dream, meaning it wasn't just for me, it was for the community. And this is what the dream said in one sentence. It said, there's nothing wrong with the human species today except one thing. Now, that alone is startling. I bet if I invited you to pull out paper and pencil, gave you 10 minutes, you could come up with about 55 things that's wrong with the human species today. But that's wonderful. That's something so wonderful about dreams. They surprise us. So the dream said, there's nothing wrong with human species today except one thing. You have forgotten the sense of the sacred. Well, that's important information. Does that mean if we got the sense of the sacred back, that this is how our species will wake up? And all of its institutions that are failing us, from government and politics, economics, education, religion, media, agriculture, is any of it doing its job correctly at this time? Here's how Thomas Berry put it, one of the great eco-prophets of our time. An absence of a sense of the sacred is the basic flaw, he writes, in many of our efforts at ecologically, environmentally adjusting our human presence to the natural world. It has been said, we will not save what we do not love. It is also true that we will neither love nor save what we do not experience as sacred. Eventually, only our sense of the sacred will save us. Buck Ghosthorse, a Lakota teacher who I worked with a lot, he was on my faculty, he said to me one day, you want to know how sacred water is? Go without it for 3 days. It's a very simple practice. It's not easy, but it's very simple. If we have forgotten the sense of the sacredness of water, go without it for 3 days. I live in California. We just came out of a 7-year drought. California's a lot of people, 40 million people. I think a lot of people on a daily basis began slowly to realize how sacred water is, how precious it is, how today we cannot take it for granted anymore. Not only water, but air. last summer, 150 miles from where I live, north of where I live, there were these great wildfires in California that destroyed a lot of human beings, a lot of communities, homes, businesses, and the rest. But we who lived 150 miles away, were not spared. Our sky was black for 6 weeks. I was afraid to take my dog out for a walk because of what the air would do to her lungs. I remember I visited San Francisco for some meeting. Half the people were walking around with masks on. This is where we're at today as a species. We can no longer take healthy air, healthy water, even healthy soil for granted anymore. This is a wake-up time. And you people in Australia, you know about the extreme heats and fires and all the rest that are going on. When I met with 150 scientists for a week 2 summers ago, the theme was climate change. They said simply, the dry areas are going to get drier, and the wet areas are going to get wetter. And that's exactly what's happening. I have a friend, he's Native American, who on his 50th birthday treated himself to climbing Mount Kilimanjaro in Eastern Africa. When he got to the top, he wept. He wept because the glaciers there are melting so rapidly, and they furnish water for so much of Eastern Africa. The same thing is happening in the Himalayas that serves water for so much of Southeast Asia, where so many human beings live. The glaciers are melting there. So all this is happening. It's a time for all hands on deck. You know, we learned as children that Nero fiddled while Rome burned. Well, today, there's a lot of fiddling going on. We're acting as if education and academia continue the way they are and have been, or agriculture, or business, or economics, or politics. That's fiddling. While the planet burns. When I was in my first year of college, I was 17 years old. It was in Dubuque, Iowa, which is on the Mississippi River. And just a month or two into the school year, the Mississippi started overflowing. There's a lot of rain and a big overflowing. I'll never forget it because everyone, it was all hands on deck. Everyone went down to the river to fill sandbags with sand. And in Dubuque at that time, there was a Lutheran seminary, a Presbyterian seminary, a Catholic seminary, a very strong Jewish community, and all the rest. We were all there, and no one asked you what your religion was, because it was a crisis moment. If you could fill a sandbag, we didn't care whom you worshiped or didn't worship. It was survival. That story, my friends, is a global story today. We are all there today. So we're invited, Gaia is inviting us to move beyond our religious silos to bring whatever wisdom and whatever courage and whatever generosity and whatever love your particular tradition has to offer. When Jesus says, love your neighbor, do we just jump to the conclusion he's talking about our two-legged neighbor in the next condo or something? Isn't air our neighbor? Air is more intimate than our neighbors. It's what goes on in our lungs. Without it, we don't live. Isn't he talking about loving the waters and the soil? We have to move out of the anthropocentric projections on some of our most true and tried phrases. Bill Everson, a California poet who had been a Dominican for 16 years, writes, "The ordinary person sees God in nature or sees God not at all." By extension, the God-thirsting person sees God everywhere, for nature is omnipresent. Emerson said that nature is the language of God. It is fittingly spoken, for in the beginning was the Word, and in that beginning is its end. The Word then is all, for nature itself holds the clue to the divine. The archetype, the language for recovering the sacredness of nature, the sacredness of the universe, the sacredness of our place in the universe, and of all the beings that we are interconnected with, that archetype in the West is called the cosmic Christ. In Christianity, Judaism calls it Shalom, the image of God. And Buddhism calls it the Buddha nature. They're all saying the same thing, that within nature itself is found the sacred, the divine. So John 1, reminding us that Christ is a light in all things. And today's physics tells us that every atom has light waves in it, so that the universe is filled both with darkness and with light, and with a sacred light. And that's what Thomas Berry teaches, that when we lose a sense of the sacred, where do we recover it? And he is very clear about that, where we recover a sense of the sacred when it's lost, when it's been lost. Here's what he says: we will recover our sense of wonder and our sense of the sacred only if we appreciate the universe beyond ourselves as a revelatory experience of that numinous presence whence all things come into being. Indeed, the universe is the primary sacred reality. The universe, therefore, is the primary sacrament. We become sacred by our participation in this more sublime dimension of the world about us. So again, it is about recovering a sense of the whole. And what is so wonderful and really synchronistic about our time is that, yes, on the one hand, the ecological connectivity has been rent asunder, but on the other hand, we are receiving a new creation story from science that is capable of reuniting us as a tribe, A story full of awe and wonder, that all of us have been birthed over a 13.8 billion year period. We've been brought into this universe, our home, and this universe we now know as of 2 summers ago is 2 trillion galaxies big. For decades we thought it was a few 100 billion galaxies big. Now 2 trillion galaxies big. And I've been told by 2 scientists what that means is this: because each galaxy has hundreds of billions of stars, that there are more stars in the universe than there are grains of sand on all the beaches on Earth. And what is a star? Our sun is kind of a medium-sized star. Our sun holds 1 million Earths. That's how big a star is. 1 million Earths. And there are more stars than there are grains of sand on our beaches. Next time you're at a beach, pick up a grain of sand and meditate on that fact for about 3 years. Notice the word that Thomas Berry used, wonder and universe and sacred, he puts right together. Rabbi Heschel says, wonder is the act of the human mind confronting the universe. It's wondrous. It's marvelous. It is miraculous that we are a species that can learn this 13.8 billion year history and this expanding universe that is our home, that is still expanding. It should fill every one of us, and especially our young people, with awe and wonder. And that, as Rabbi Heschel says, is the beginning of wisdom. And wisdom is what we need today. That's why we have a rotting educational system, because our rotten educational system is built about knowledge, not wisdom. We have knowledge factories. We do not have wisdom schools. And that's why the earth is being destroyed. Thomas Berry says, most of the destruction of the planet is happening in the hands of people with PhDs. A lot of people here have PhDs. I got one. Beware. We should wear a sign, beware. Because we may be very educated in knowledge with our left brain. We got all the facts. But how about our mystical brains, the intuitive brain, which is where values come from? Albert Einstein said that. He said, we've been given two gifts, the gift of rationality and the gift of intuition. He says, do not overvalue rationality, because values do not come from the intellect, says Einstein. They come from intuition and deep feeling, which are the same thing. And another word for that is mysticism. And then he goes on and he says, we live in a society that honors the first and ignores the second. And he says the first, rationality, should serve the second, should serve intuition, because that's where our values come from. I love to quote Einstein in this, because no one can accuse him of being anti-intellectual. But he was so aware of the power of imagination and the power of intuition and deep feeling, which, as he says, is the birthplace of values. And so our education that is so lurched into just one hemisphere of the brain is essentially an education without values. And that's why Einstein said, and I quote, I abhor American education, unquote. But Australian education isn't off the hook either. You got to look at that. So how do we bring it back, this sense of the sacred and this sense of the cosmos? There's a wonderful book by Scott Russell Sanders called Hunting for Hope, A Father's Journeys. And he took a 2-year sabbatical because a 17-year-old son confronted him and said, Dad, you're always writing about the earth and how much trouble it's in. Don't you have any hope? I don't even want to be around you anymore. Where's your joy? Where's your hope? So this fellow Sanders was able to take a 2-year sabbatical looking for hope. And this is one of his stories. He says, I still hanker for the original world, the one that makes us, rather than the one we make. I hunger for contact with the shaping power that curves the comet's path, fills the owl's throat with song, and fashions every flake of snow and carpets the hills with green. It is a prodigal, awful, magnificent power, forever casting new forms into existence, then tearing them apart and starting over. And he talks about how one night he was driving his car and the stars were out, and it was such an amazing moment. He stopped his car. He says, I climbed out of the car with a greeting on my lips, but the sky hushed me. From the black bowl of space, countless fiery lights shone down, each one a sun or a swirl of suns, the whole brilliant host of them enough to strike me dumb. Nature is full of genius, full of the divinity, so that not a snowflake escapes its fashioning hand. The universe exists at all. that it obeys laws, that those laws have brought forth galaxies and stars and planets, and on one planet at least, life, and our life, and out of life, consciousness, out of consciousness, these words, this breath. All this is a chain of wonders. I dangle from that chain and hold on tight. We dangle on that chain of wonders and hold on tight. I think that's a good metaphor of what it means to recover the sacred. And we are wedded to it. We are made for the sacred. Like we are made for the cosmos. Nothing less will satisfy us. And that is why there's such an industry, so many industries, of addiction in a culture that has lost its cosmology and is still seeking for something big to turn it on. So what about this archetype from our own tradition of the cosmic Christ? Some people say, oh, that's so New Age, cosmic Christ. Oh, that's Teilhard de Chardin, 20th century, cosmic Christ. No, it's not. It's the oldest sources in the Christian Bible. Let me say it again. The oldest sources in the Christian Bible. Paul and the Gospel of Thomas. Before the four Gospels were written, they were shouting about the cosmic Christ. And it's been lost practically. Appalling that it's been lost. The reductionism done on the first responders to the Jesus event. Joseph Sittler, a renowned Lutheran theologian, in 1956 was at the World Council of Churches gathering in New Delhi, and he chose Colossians 1 as the source of his keynote speech. And of course, Colossians 1 is talking about the Christ who holds everything together in the heavens and the earth and all the rest, the cosmic Christ. And Sittler said, what happened? The Christ event began with this incandescent cosmic explosion of light, and now it's become a flickering flame in the little soul, if you're lucky. That was 1956. Well, I think what happened, among other things, was that split of science and religion, psyche and cosmos. And the preoccupation with our human, narcissistic fear of death, and therefore wondering if we're going to be saved or not. A complete trivialization of the events. Now, I wrote a book on the coming of the cosmic Christ. I call it 30 years ago. And about 10 years ago, a woman came up to me after a lecture. She said, I just love your book on the cosmic Christ. I love it so much I read it twice. It changed my life. It brought me back to my Christian roots in the deepest sense. But I have this one question. I said, what's that? She said, what's a cosmic Christ? Now, every author should have that experience once in their lifetime. Not twice. Once is enough. But actually, I've had 12 years to meditate on that, and I take it as a compliment now. Why? Because the left brain gives you definitions. The right brain doesn't. It gives you experiences. You have to experience the cosmic Christ. That's what it means to say that it's an archetype of mysticism. Mysticism is about tasting. It's not about thinking. It's not about defining. So, of course, we turn to the poet, because there are two languages for responding to mysticism. One is silence, and that's an important language, and the other is art, in any form. So this is Mary Oliver. You know, people know Mary Oliver here in Australia, a very authentic North American mystic. Her poem, At the River Clarion, she begins, I don't know who God is exactly. Oh, she's going to talk about God. But differently from most theologians who seem to know exactly who God is, except Jesus never told us exactly who God was, did he? She says, but I'll tell you this. Oh, is she going to tell us a story? Well, kind of like what Jesus did. I was sitting in the river named Clarion on a water-splashed stone. And all afternoon I listened to the voices of the river talking. Whenever the water struck the stone, it had something to say. And the water itself, and even the mosses trailing under the water. And slowly, very slowly, it became clear to me what they were saying. Said the river, I am part of holiness. And I too, said the stone. And I too, whispered the moss beneath the water. That, my friends, in half a page, is the cosmic Christ. It's the holiness in all things. It's Thomas Merton saying, every non-two-legged creature is a saint. There's holiness everywhere. Water is holy. Go without it for 3 days. You'll learn. Everything we take for granted. Then Mary Oliver goes on and explains why it took her so long to get this. I'd been to the river before a few times. Don't blame the river that nothing happened quickly. You don't hear such voices in an hour or a day. You don't hear them at all if selfhood has stuffed your ears. And it's difficult to hear anything anyway through all the traffic and ambition. If God exists, he isn't just churches and mathematics. He's the forest. He's the desert. He's the ice caps that are dying. He's the ghetto and the Museum of Fine Arts. He's Van Gogh and Allen Ginsberg and Robert Motherwell. He's the many desperate hands cleaning and preparing their weapons. He's every one of us potentially, the leaf of grass, the genius, the politician, the poet. And if this is true, isn't it something very important? Yes, the cosmic Christ archetype is something very important because it ushers in a new era, which in fact is in many ways an older era, where psyche and cosmos can come together, where all beings are recognized as revelations, not just a book that is so modern. Just because we invented the printing press, la, 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 we think the Word of God is a book. I beg your pardon, 13.8 billion years, and God had nothing to say until the Gutenberg came along? Get over it. That's why we're crazy. Aquinas said Revelation comes in 2 volumes, nature and the Bible. We've been leaving nature out. Any seminary that does not have mystical scientists on it is not a seminary. They should shut down. Because scientists are here to tell us about nature. And many scientists bring their heart to their vocation. Most of them do, if they're invited. John Dominic Crossan, in his book on Paul, says that for Paul, you cannot be a Christian without being a mystic. Well, that means we have to shut down 98% of our seminaries because they're not turning out mystics. It's just the opposite. I can't tell you how many ministers I've talked to over my career who said to me they entered the seminary because they'd had mystical experiences. By the time they came out at the end of the sausage factory, all the mysticism was gone. One Lutheran minister told me that, and he said he realized that when he got ordained that, hey, where was that mysticism that got me into this business in the first place? So he went off and found a medicine man, a Lakota, Native American, to be his spiritual director. And he had an amazing experience as a Lutheran minister in Rockford, Illinois, a very blue-collar town, where he would marry his indigenous practices with the Lutheran practice. For example, confirmation. They would take the boys out for sweat lodges with men who would tell the stories of what it is to be a man, and the girls out with sweat lodges with women to tell the stories about womanhood. And he got away with this for his entire ministry. Albert Einstein said, that we are entering into a third phase of religion. Now, Einstein was not at all pleased with either Protestant or Roman Catholic response to Hitler. So he was pretty fed up with organized religion back in the 30s when he fled Germany. And this is one reason why he was driven, especially after the Holocaust, to say this. We are now moving to the third phase of religious experience, cosmic religion. Cosmic religion. For him, cosmic religion will have two dimensions. One is conscience. The conscience is more important than nationhood or religious affiliation or anything else. Conscience and the cosmos. This is how he puts it. With our growing knowledge of the vastness of the universe and its trillions of stars, each one many times larger than our planet, stars whose light take hundreds of years to reach our eyes, humans must consider it an insult when we are told that our conduct should be motivated by fear of punishment or hope of reward. It is just as much an insult to the God who created all these marvels to be lowered to a human level. The true religious genius has always been endowed with a sense of cosmic religion. This oneness of creation, to my sense, is God, says Einstein. God is the oneness of creation. This concept of God will unite all nations. A new age of peace will be inaugurated when all people profess a cosmic religion, when the youth have become lay people with scientific minds. So that was his vision. And I think we're there today. I think the ecological crisis is rattling our cages so profoundly that the cosmic religion is now ready to be adapted. And again, in our Western tradition, not only the New Testament, but Judaism too. There was a brilliant book done a year or two ago by Rabbi David Cederman. I met him actually at a Sundance, and he told me about writing this book, and I certainly encouraged him. But in the book, he was trying to develop a ecological theology based on his Jewish tradition. And so he asked one question, just one question, of his entire tradition. The Bible, the Midrash, Moses Maimonides, the Kabbalah, all of it right up to the Hasidism and the rest. One question, and it is this. Does the image of God apply only to the human, or does it apply to all beings? His conclusion, it applies to all beings. And in fact, in his book, he talks about the pattern that connects. And I rang him up and I said, that's Paul's statement for the cosmic Christ, the pattern that connects. You know, we're in this together. And the same is true of the Buddhist teaching, that every being is a face of the Buddha. And that every being is another Buddha. In fact, I was lecturing in South Korea a couple of years ago, and a Buddhist monk came up to me afterwards. He said, I never heard this phrase, cosmic Christ, he said, but I really like it. I'm going to start preaching about the cosmic Buddha. So this insight, this intuition that humans have had around the world, that divinity is being revealed in all beings, this is universal. Hildegard of Bingen says, every ray of the sun is the sun, so every ray of God is God. And this is found in the Church Fathers as well. Now, I don't know how we're doing time-wise. You want to tell me? I should wind up? Okay. I'll wind up. Let me just make one very practical proposal that about how we put this into practice in terms of our vocation to be mystics, lovers, and prophets defending Mother Earth. I was at a conference recently at the Sierra Club held in Berkeley, and I was asked to speak about the Pope's encyclical Laudato Si, and also about the new order of the sacred earth, which I'll talk about tomorrow. But one fellow, a scientist, was asked to speak. He got up. He's from India originally, but he's been in Silicon Valley for years, and he quit Silicon Valley to work on this issue, namely the planet's survival. And he got up and he said, now listen to me, because I'm an engineer, I know my numbers. And here's the deal. Humans did an amazing thing. When we tore down a lot of forests, we heated up the planet, and this prevented an ice age. We prevented an ice age from happening several thousand years ago. But of course, now he said we're doing the same thing. We're tearing down forests, and the opposite is happening. That is to say, we're creating all this heat. So the obvious solution is, he said, planting trees. And he said, this is what I figured out. If everybody became vegan, we could return all the land we've given to livestock to grow trees in. And that would stop climate change in 10 years and reverse it. And I've done my homework and I had all these figures about it. Now, my response is, of course, that there's a spectrum. Some can do vegan. A lot of young people are especially feeling called to that. Then there's vegetarianism. And then there's just cutting way back on our meat diets. But the point is that we could really be contributing something positive and direct. I was just in New Zealand, and I brought this subject up, and this one guy had just heard on BBC that there are 3 trillion trees in the world. We need 1 trillion more to turn back global warming. So he's starting a club to plant 1 million trees in New Zealand. Now, Australia has a lot more room than New Zealand. And I think you want to think real seriously about this. This is something, people say, what can I do? What can I do? Well, panic doesn't do anything. Despair doesn't do anything. And denial doesn't do anything. David Orr, the eco-philosopher, says, hope is a verb with the sleeves rolled up. Hope is a verb with the sleeves rolled up. I've been talking about the work, the inner work, of recovering our relationship to the cosmos as a sacred being with all of its sacred beings. That is inner work. That's the role of the mystic. But now, the role of action. There are many things we can do, but this one thing, I think, is really important and exciting and doable. Can we plant 1 trillion trees in the next 10 years and thereby save the planet as we know it? Of course, the planet's going to survive, but it's going to lose a lot of its diversity, a lot of its beauty, and of course, a lot of its humans, among other species that are marvelously beautiful, if we don't act. So, with that, then I will close and just remind you that this archetype of the cosmic Christ, Jung says archetypes come when we need them. And I think we desperately need to move beyond the narcissism that the modern consciousness has taught us and that is embedded in all of our professions. And I think this kind of rattling of our anthropocentric cages is exactly what's possible and necessary. And it connects us to the indigenous people. When I was in Melbourne in the early 90s, and we did a program there, Eddie Kneebone, a Aboriginal leader in this country, was on our faculty, and he was interviewed in this book that came out afterwards called Creation, Spirituality, and the Dream Time. And he says that I have realized that humans create the buildings that we call churches, but God created the world. If I look for God, then it will be in the environment that he built. And that this parallels what a Native American or Native Filipino told me several years ago, she was a student in my program. She was a rainforest Indian in the Philippines. She said a Catholic sister came to her tribe one day and said, "What's the biggest mistake we Westerners have made dealing with you indigenous people?" They took 3 days aside as a tribe to get a consensus. They liked the question. They came back and they said, "You Westerners, you put God in a little white house, and the rest of creation you treat however you like." Well, that's exactly what Eddie Kneebone was saying too. That we live in the universe primarily. That's where the sacred energy is. We have to get in out of the rain or the cold, that's one thing. But God doesn't mind getting wet. And the divine is in the big spaces as well as in the small spaces. And that's our invitation. Thank you. Is there time for discussion?
Yes.
Oh, great. Super.
That's 15 minutes.
Super. Great. Thank you. Okay. Stay right here. I'll do that. Okay.
Get that going. Thank you, Matthew. That was wonderful, and I think that's given you something to go away and think about overnight and for the next year. We've time for some questions. The rules here are pretty simple. Keep your questions succinct. We don't want statements. Think about what it is that you want to ask so that the question is immediately clear to Matthew and to everybody else. That's the first rule. The second rule here, we have a strict partiality for equality. The first questioner will be a woman, the next will be a male, and so forth. Now we've got people with microphones. We've got John over here, and we've got Jolly on over there. Put your hand up if you wish to make a question, and there we've got one right at the very back.
James O'Donoghue, Brisbane. Where do you see worship liturgy going? Like you said, I presume the commentary about the church being insipid is a commentary about the liturgies and worship. What are you kind of drawing and sort of advising? So some people are religious and obviously want to come to communal worship. What are you sort of suggesting in the future of worship, liturgy and common prayer?
Well, the reason I became Episcopalian actually was to work with young people to reinvent forms of worship. It's the form that's the problem. And just like it's a form of education that is the problem. We leave the right brain out. We leave the lower chakras out. We leave the heart out. And this is my little story quickly. I finished my book on the reinvention of work, or I thought I had, and then I had a dream and it said there was one more chapter, and that was reinventing ritual. So I finished the book with reinventing ritual, and I laid down some principles such as bringing the body back and bringing silence and the contemplative dimension back and so forth. And then I handed my manuscript in, and the next weekend I was in Seattle for a conference we were doing on creative spirituality, and 5 young people from Sheffield, England flew in. And it turned out that they had a story to tell. They had a lot of journalistic material with them, that they were a rave community. And Sheffield was very much the Rust Belt of the UK that was crashing at the time. So there was a lot of unemployment, which meant there was a lot of alcoholism and abuse at home. So a lot of these young people were kicked out of their homes by drunken fathers. So the rave community was their home, if you will. And after they were doing their dancing and the rest together for a while, it dawned on them, this is kind of like religion, isn't it? So they went to the local Anglican church, the pastor, the rector, and said, we want to bring this to church. He said, oh, fine, go ahead. So they were doing their rave mass, they called it the planetary mass, for about 6 months, and the rector came to them one day and said, "I'm sorry, you have to leave now." They said, "Why?" He said, "I'm getting complaints that there are too many young people in church." Mark that well. You know? The last time that sentence has been uttered in the West. So then they found a secular place in downtown Sheffield, and they had their masses there every week, and they developed this community. They had over 400 people involved in creating the Mass. Liturgy means the work of the people. It doesn't mean work out of a can, the people. So to make a long story short, I flew over and checked it out, and I was very impressed with what they were doing. I said, "How can I help you guys?" Well, they said, "If you became an Episcopal priest, you could run interference because you get what we're doing. We're already using your Cosmic Christ theology." And so I thought about it. The Pope had just fired me a few months before, so he didn't need me anymore. So I went to the Episcopal bishop in San Francisco and said, "Here's the deal. I'm thinking of becoming Episcopal priest only for one reason, to help young people reinvent forms of worship." And he said, "The church isn't doing anything for young people. Go for it." And I said, "Will you protect me from your right wing? Because I've just been through 12 years fighting the Vatican, and I'm not doing this again in the name of religion." He said, "I'll tell you a story. My priesthood began in West Virginia during the Civil Rights Movement." He said, "I took on presidents of the mining companies around civil rights. I'm a street fighter. I may not read any of your books, but I'll protect you from my right wing." So we shook hands, and I said, "We can do business together." So to make a long story short, we created in California, in Oakland area where I was living, the Cosmic Mass, we call it, and we've done over 100 of them in North America. We just did one at the World Parliament in Toronto this November. We did one in Salt Lake City at the World Parliament 2 years previously. And we've trained many people to do it. And it really works. It really works. And it's all ages that come, although the young people, especially young men, are very happy to lead the computers and the rap and so forth. You see, we're taking in this new postmodern art forms, such as rap and DJing and VJing and the rest. And that's the importance of it. It's kind of like the Middle Ages when they discovered stained glass. They brought it to church, and it made a difference. It was delightful. Well, it's the same thing with these other art forms. So many churches are stuck in the modern consciousness of reading and sitting at a bench and daring to be kept awake by the preacher. Amazing things happen in our cosmic masses. You can look them up. But healings happen of all kinds. Here's just one example. We did a mass for 1,000 people at a Sounds True retreat 2 summers ago in the mountains of Colorado. And afterwards, a woman came up, and there were all kinds of people. There were rabbis, there were Buddhists, Hindus, Sufis, Christians, and the rest. This woman comes up. She says, "I'm an atheist. I'm a fierce atheist. I'm such a fierce atheist that when I'm walking down the street and there's a church, I cross the street to go by the church." But she said, and then she pointed to her heart, she said, "When we do that grieving thing," and see, we do grieving together every time. Grieving is so needed today. We need grieving practice. Everyone needs them. We get down on all sixes and we do this grieving ritual that we've developed. She said, "When we did that, something happened to me." She pointed to her heart. Something shifted. She said, "By the time communion came along, I was hungry and had to have some." She said, "My whole life has changed here tonight." But I'm just pointing out that worship, Melodome Somi says there is no community without ritual. So ritual is absolutely essential. And ritual is the way you bring psyche and cosmos together. Look at Stonehenge. Look at Stonehenge. What got these people out of their couches to turn off the TV sets, to go out and drag 1,000-pound rocks before there were wheels for miles and miles? What got them out of their couches? It was psyche and cosmos yearning to connect. The solstice, the equinox. That's what is ritual. Otto Rank says, ritual that does not connect cosmos and psyche is not ritual. Having your nose in a book is not proof that you're praying. In fact, for indigenous people, it's crazy that we white people read prayers. They can't believe that we read prayers. They say, you don't bring a prayer book into a sweat lodge. The lights are out, for one thing. You pray with your heart, not with your eyes. Not with your eyes. Rilke said that 100 years ago. The work of the eyes is finished now. Go and do heart work on all the images that are imprisoned within you. So that's what worship has to be. And that's why dancing in the presence of images. So, for example, we always pick a theme for our Cosmic Mass. For example, the return of the Divine Feminine. And for that theme, we'll have a lot of pictures of the goddess from all over the world traditions, including the West. And you're dancing then in the presence of the goddess. So that's the sermon. You're bringing in you're meditating on these images and dancing to it. So it's bodily, radically bodily. And you're all dancing the same images, but you're all dancing differently because you interpret them differently. The same is true of masses we've had, like the mass we had at the Washington Cathedral was on healing racism. It was a very edgy mass, but it really worked. And we got a lot of young black talent from Washington to lead and so forth. So picking a theme is very important. But within that context then, you gather the fractals, you create the images, and then we're dancing. And it's in dance that you give your heart back. And you get stronger. Now, that's not the only way to worship, but it is a powerful way to worship. And we've been doing it now for 25 years, and I have a lot of evidence that it works for a lot of people, and it wakes up a lot of people. And you don't need a crying room. Children, not once have we had a child unhappy at this Mass. Children love to dance, and if they get tired, they dance on their father's shoulders or their mother's. And so really, there's so much more we can be doing about worship. We have to deconstruct what we've been doing and reconstruct it. And one thing we found is that if you really look deep in the Western liturgy, it follows the four paths of creative spirituality. You begin with joy, then the grieving, then the creativity of the Eucharist, and then the final dance is always a warrior dance to get the energy up to go out and make a difference in the world.
We'll have one more question, I think, before we wrap up for the evening. And this one's got to be from a woman.
Hello, I'd like to ask, is it possible that we could do some dancing at the conference?
What's the question? I'm sorry, I didn't hear it.
What was the question? We didn't hear it up here.
My question is, can we do any dancing at this Common Dreams conference?
Can you do what? A cosmic mass?
Dancing.
What?
Here.
Dancing. Oh, here. Yeah, dancing. Right. Well, I would certainly recommend it. I don't know if, I didn't, what can I say? I didn't bring any materials with me, but I think dancing is always good for the soul. If you want to do a spiral dance or a circle dance, I'd be happy to lead that. I can lead those things. But I like the question because we really have to bring all our chakras to everything we're doing today. One problem of the modern era, we've been taught to study from the neck up, to think from the neck up, and to pray from the neck up. And that just will not do. Our hearts are in our bodies, not in our heads. And so waking up to Mother Earth, for example, it's your foot chakra, your knee chakra that connects to the foot chakra, that has to be engaged if you're really going to make connections with sacred Mother Earth. You can't just be sitting in the top of your head and talking about Mother Earth. So the lesson is there, whether you do it this particular weekend. I'm sure this weekend is already planned. But you can go home and do it, and you can go to your community and do it, and create your own rituals. And you're very free to borrow from ours. We have a web page about the Cosmic Mass. You can learn about it there. But the whole question about bringing the body to what we do is extremely important. That's how the body politic gets inspired. There is a connection between our bodies and the body politic and the way we treat both. Thank you.